Hello YouTube, I'm back. In this video, I'm actually going to be talking instead of writing writing words and then showing the paragraphs with mute. I want to make this a quick video as the reason for that being the case. With that said, let me just talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing in this video. So this is going to be me talking about why. And this is something I've already talked about on my channel a long time ago. But so this is going to be about why shapes, if we can argue for God, we argue for a God, then we have to argue for shapes. If we argue for shapes, we have to argue for God. It goes both ways. And so much so that distinguishing between God and shapes is how to determine if there's a God or not. Not just if there is shapes, but distinguishing between shapes and the concept of shapes and the concept of God. Well, I'll tell you right now, it's not very hard, it doesn't take very long. Following a very simple step-by-step procedure, as I am going to explain shortly. So, as most people understand it to be the case, shapes are, they look like this. Basic pre-K stuff, common knowledge. This is the three-dimensional view of just some basic shapes. And I want to say that this is all we really need here to compare to God, the concept of God. Reason being, these shapes are actually made of other shapes. If you observe closely, you'll see that all of these are consistent with the laws of physics. This is actually just an image I got off of Google Images, and then I used Creative Commons to download the image. Okay, you can look up 3D shapes. This is what I did not too long ago. I looked up 3D shapes, then I went to Google Images and I just hit Creative Commons on the filter. So it's legitimate. You can find this image yourself. So what are shapes made of? Well, shapes are made of particles. And those particles are made of other particles, so on and so forth. And all those particles are made of shapes, as we all know already. Because all those particles have shape, they have form, and a form is a shape. Now, most people agree to that, those things, which is good. But the problem still remains, and the question still remains, does God exist? Well, God exists, in my opinion. I've talked a great deal about that on my channel for a long time. I've given a lot of evidence, but let's look at this a little bit closer. So we say that these shapes are made of particles, and then we say those particles themselves are actually just shapes, also shapes. Well, okay. So basically, all these shapes are just made of shapes, like I was originally saying. Since even the particles they are made of are just tinier shapes that clump together to form larger shapes. Now, the only thing that's really that really can make this that throws people off is just a question of if shapes do exist, but they needed to be created to exist, which would, seem to be the case, then what shape, or non-shape rather, could have created these shapes. So I'll be honest. There's no real way to answer this question other than to study and dissect these shapes and roll with what we can examine and observe of them in relation to other things that we examine and observe, things we already know, common knowledge. And let's see and compare the results of those things and see what we can find. And I'll tell you right now, I've already done this. I've already made a video like this a long time ago on this channel on the same thing, but this time I'm giving a simplified view of what I'm saying. So, as I was saying, so these shapes are just made of other tinier shapes. So the question is really just at this point, if God did create these shapes, by what means did God create these shapes? Let's start with this shape. It's just a sphere. Well, what do we notice about this sphere? It's just, well, it's just tinier shapes that are going and forming together in certain directions to go to form a circle shape, as why the line goes in a circle path instead of other paths. Well, that just means that the particles are being forced to move in a certain direction on a certain path to form a certain line, to have a certain curvature. But that doesn't tell us everything we need to know about this. It just tells us that this is just a sphere like any other ordinary sphere, circle, or whatever else you want to call it. And if that's really the case, then there's really nothing more to add to this as far as what we can see just from looking at it. But there's still another question that lingers in my mind about this sphere, and that's if it's made of particles that are tiny particles, what shape are those particles? Of course, most people would just say it could be any shape. It wouldn't really matter as long as they come together on a specific path, which is kind of true. Because if you just put them together, then they'll eventually form that larger structure. But still, there has to be. It has to do with the molecular bonds of the particles themselves. That's why some atoms are able to be have a smooth surface and others do not. If the atoms have a smooth surface, it's because the molecular bonds aren't as strong. Like with liquids, for example, the atoms are still there, but the surface is smooth, flat. Well, it's the same thing with this sphere. At certain edges and curves, it's flat. That's why there's curvature. Whereas with, say, the square, it's different. The molecular bonds of the atoms are different for every shape, with their differences. However, it still doesn't tell us everything we need to know about to answer the question I was originally bringing up, which is, again, as I said, what is what was it? What is the how can we examine this further? Because all we're doing is talking about basic facts that almost anybody knows about spheres and pre-K shapes. Well, either way, one thing's for sure. What we do know of these shapes is that of this shape is that it really does not um, appear to be able to do much other than be moved around by other forces and other forces external to it, such as electromagnetism, gravity, inertia, um, and form certain what most people consider various forms of energy. And for as far as we're concerned, and as scientists and physicists are concerned, in fact, as far as almost any education system taught human individual or textbook says, the sphere is just what it does is it just sits there. It's pretty much stationary. Some percentage of the time, and the other percentage of the time, it's not stationary. And when it's not stationary, it's just being manipulated or moved around by forces external to it. So it's just that's its purpose. It's that which pretty much necessarily means that it doesn't really, from what we can observe of that does not imply that it can create shapes. It just doesn't imply that. I mean, all it really does is just imply that it's just this thing to be manipulated by forces external to it. Everything that we have that I've just described about those other forces external to it, I'm referencing common knowledge. Those are people know that stuff already. So almost everyday people know that. That's common knowledge. So it's safe to assume my viewers would understand that too. They're like everyday people. They have common knowledge. Um, so this pretty much means is that how do I say it? Like this sphere is just like all it can really do is just be moved around or deconstructed, dissected. Even when you do deconstruct it, you're basically taking its components and moving them around to examine it further. So, like when you have inanimate objects, of course, or when you dissect something, just take the thing and you just you use a force external to it to break an opening into the thing, and then use that opening to make more openings in it to dissect it. You're just taking the particles and weakening the molecular bonds of the particles, or you're flat out removing certain particles from the object and throwing them far away from the original remainder of the object. So it's kind of like if you could take a toy, an action figure, and you could just take the arm off of it and throw it far away, or you could leave the arm there and just poke a hole in the arm, and all the atoms are still there, but now the molecular bonds of the part that you put a hole into is the molecular bond is now less strong between the two ends by which it was attached originally. But you didn't actually take that piece and throw it away from the original action figure. You just poked a hole in it and weaken the molecular bond. Now, in either cases of those being the case with this sphere, you would still just be dissecting and deconstructing the object to try to examine it, to understand it further. But in doing so, you could never possibly, there would not be anything to examine within the layers, its many layers, that would actually show that it is able to create shapes. You merely would just be seeing just seeing some other shapes, just stationary or moving around, and that's it. Just some shapes, stationary or moving around by the forces external to them. But just because a thing is moving, being moved by something else, doesn't mean that it's creating something. The concept itself of creation does not really have anything to do with being manipulated by something else. Not in such a way where just because you're being moved around, that's going to create things. To say it would just be miraculous, and by that logic, anything could be moving and just creating everything just by moving, which is not what most people would say is what happens. I mean, most people agree that just because you're moving or something is moving, that doesn't mean that it's creating something. Reason being, the evidence suggests that's not how it works. But let's take a second to think about it in a different way. Let's say that somehow, this is theoretical, of course. Let's just say that somehow there is a way that, what is it called? What is it called? It's called, sorry, I was thinking of the right word to describe it. The non-physical, let's say the non-physical is God. Of course, most people agree God is non-physical. The concept is of something that isn't physical. Reason being, they don't want to argue that the physical could create itself. Now, the physical is these things where the physical, you could think of it like this sphere here. It's physical. But if we say that the physical, like this sphere, could create physical things like itself, then we're like saying that this sphere right here can miraculously create something just like itself, merely by moving around. The absurdity of that is ridiculously off the charts. So, just because when we compare it to the evidence of what does happen in everyday life, it shows that that doesn't happen. So, just by that, we know that, well, spheres do not create spheres, nor is this one right here. And if that's really the case, then I find it pretty hard to believe that there's anything that can be shown, or that will ever be shown, for a sphere like this to create, or any sphere that is different to this one, bigger or whatever, would create any shape or any shape like it. Now here's the thing. I also wanted to clarify something else about this, because this is a source of confusion, I believe. And that's that, well, a sphere is honestly if we think of it as being that God is non-physical, then we would have to say that God created this sphere. Now that's already a problem, because if we're going to really argue that, we're going to have to show something to prove that there's evidence of that. We're going to have to dissect this sphere. We're going to have to dissect it in every way until we know for a fact that it could not have created itself. Now, fortunately, that's already been done by people, because, of course, people already use this line of thinking when they examine and have always examined shapes and matter, for example. They already know that it does not miraculously create itself. Just by dissecting it, you can put it in a science lab, look at it under a microscope, run other tests on it, and you'll see that it just moves around by forces external to it. But it doesn't actually create any other thing external to it. It doesn't actually create itself, and it doesn't create things like it. It's just moved around by forces external to it. Well, one thing's for sure. I'm just going to try to make this video come to a close soon, because I gotta say, I have another video I intend on making that I think is going to be easier to, first of all, argue and describe what I mean, but also I think it'll be more convincing for the kinds of things I've argued on my channel than this video will be. But anyway, let me just try to explain this a little bit better. So this is pretty much all we can say about this. The only thing I want to say about this that I think is actually worth mentioning is that if you have a non-physical creator and you say that non-physical creator is God of, say, the Bible, for example. Okay, let's examine what we know about the God of the Bible. And that creator, as depicted in the Bible, does have shape. It has form. It's a humanoid apparition. You can refer to many passages in the Bible where it is talked about what does God look like in heaven of the Bible, and it talks about what God looks like. So that's one example. I think the best example to really use here is God being a non-physical creator of physical shapes in the Bible. Just because if I used non-physical consciousness in our world, according to the Bible, I'd have to explain it a different way for why I think it's absurd that the non-physical exists inside our world. I don't think it does. I don't think it can. So anyway, as I was saying, so the non-physical creator God of the Bible is a humanoid apparition. Okay, it's a humanoid apparition. Now let's ask the question of, What does it mean when it says humanoid apparition? Well, it just means what the two words mean. Um, if you go to Google and look up what does humanoid mean, and also look up what apparition means, it's basically referring to those two basic concepts, and it's saying that that's what God of the Bible looks like, and that's what the God of the Bible is. And the Bible also tries to argue that that same humanoid apparition is creating things while being not physical. Well, hold on a second. Before we go any further, let's ask another question. Because I don't think that I don't think what we have examined so far is very good to tell us everything we need to know about if the non-physical exists in the world or not. Now, most people would just say, yeah. I mean, the Bible says that God is a humanoid apparition. Well, of course, that must mean that the non-physical things are humanoid apparitions. Of course, they are shapes. They're shaped apparitions. These books say so. These books that everybody talks about. Yeah, that's all. That's all the evidence we need. Well, let's examine this very carefully. So if we look at this sphere, or if we looked inside of the sphere and we looked at the particles on the tiniest scales of quantum, you could say, you'll just see tiny particles and bigger particles and so on and so forth. But again, that doesn't contradict what I was saying, that they're all shapes. Doesn't contradict the laws of physics. That's just what the laws of physics is. So still, when you see that, when you see those shapes, those microparticles, you just gotta basically wonder, well, doesn't these look like the shapes and apparitions within the Bible? Now I'm going to tell you something right now. Let's pause here because here's where it gets very confusing for most people. There's two things that have to be addressed before we go any further. The first thing is, are all physical things, are all the physical things, are all the physical particles, are they all shapes? If the answer is yes, that all the physical particles that exist are shapes, then that already has a major implication about what really is God in regards to the first question, to the main question of this video that I was bringing up. So when we say we have to examine two terms here, three terms. Shape is the first term, the second term is physical, and the third term is non-physical. Are they all the same thing? And if they're not, then are some of them the same thing? Well, we know one thing. We know that all physical things, all the shapes that exist are physical things, and vice versa. Now, the other thing we know is that, of course, it is possible for those three things, that being shapes, physical things, and non-physical things, it is at least possible for them to all be one and the same. According to some definitions of the word itself, possible. Yes, according to some definitions of that word. Now, of course, according to other definitions commonly used, It's not possible. So we have to be careful about which definitions we're using as well. But let's just say that, for the sake of argument, let's say that we do not know if it is possible or not for all three of those different concepts or terms to be one and the same. And now we do not know. Okay, well then what are we going to do? Are we just going to wonder and wonder and wonder, or are we going to actually use our brain and figure it out? I mean, to be honest with you, I'd say, sorry about that. I was turning on my appliance. Now, to be honest with you, I think that we should give it a shot. We should actually use our brain to try to figure this out. The question is really simple here. Because all we really have to do to figure this out is actually really easy. Because all we really need to do is to refer back to our basic observations that we talked about earlier in this video about shapes, physical things, and non-physical things. Now, if you want, you can rewind the video to refer back to those things I talked about. I talked about what their attributes are, and I talked about their differences, or what some would call differences between them. Now, if you can refer back to those now, and then come back to this moment, then then maybe it will be easy for you, my viewer, to understand better what I mean when I say that they are not all one and the same. Physical things are not non-physical things. Not when we are referring back to those ways I had described them earlier in the video, anyway, because there are some basic differences that most people agree are there, to where they are not the exact same thing, as in the ways that I described them to be. However, still, there is still another aspect of this. One more term to address that I mentioned earlier. That is not the first two I just mentioned. It is what is physical. What is shapes? And to this, I would say you can use many different definitions, of course, of the word shapes. But again, I would recommend going off of what it is that I was arguing in the earlier portions of this video. Okay. Refer back to those, I would say, and then come back here, and that may help you better understand whether or not shapes are physical, and whether or not physical things are shapes. And now, if you have come to understand that the implication there is that physical things are shapes and that shapes are physical things, then that's a good thing, because then that will make it easier to understand if non-physical things are shapes or not. So one thing's for sure, the implication is that if shapes are physical things, then not only is the vice versa true, but it actually means that they are not any different than each other. It actually would imply that shapes are only physical things and vice versa, and they're not. Those are actually just referring to the exact same thing. It's just two different words mankind has assigned to the same exact thing. Kind of like the exact same thing with an emotion, like uh, excitement. I'm sure there's another word assigned to the concept of excitement that means the exact same thing, even though it's two different words. Well, the same thing applies to what I just said with shapes and physical. They're the same thing, same exact concept. It's just two different words. Uh, so, um, so if that's really the case, then it's um, really not that hard to see how it could be that non-physical is not a shape. Um, well, we have this sphere here. It is a physical thing. It's a shape, vice versa. And if we say that they are not any different than each other, that the shape is not any different than the physical thing is not any different than the shape, they're just two words referring to the exact same concept. They're not referring to different concepts. It's just the only difference is the words. Then it must be the case that both shapes and physical things are not non-physical. They are both the same thing, referring to the concept of non-physical in comparison, which is referring to the opposite of physical. So you could write down right now, say physical equals shape, shapes, or shape. Now, if you try to write non-physical equals those, then you'll have a mathematical error because that's not what the statements show. Um, I mean, I don't mean to say that's just because the statements say something that means it's true. I'm saying that when you refer to the statements that we've just come up with, because that's what our examination of these things shows, then clearly that's what we're referring to in this case. Then it's fair to say that, of course, shapes are physical things, vice versa, and they are not in any way the non-physical. They are just they're just the opposite. They're just to be compared to their opposite. They're not one and the same, and that's all. So if that's really the case, then it's fair to assume that it's possible that the non-physical is not a shape. If it's not a shape, then it would not look anything like this sphere here. In fact, it wouldn't look like any of the other shapes near it. The square, be it the square, the pyramid, triangle, and the hexagon. So, if that's really the case, then it's pretty clear that they are definitely not. Those are definitely not non-physical. So, I mean, when you say physical, you're saying this thing is meeting these conditions to be physical. When you say non-physical, you're saying this is the thing that does not meet the conditions to be physical. So, we say these squares, this square and this hexagon, this triangle, this sphere, they are not, they meet the conditions to be physical. Well, then you say non-physical, then you're saying this non-physical thing we are thinking of it's this thing we're thinking of that does not meet the conditions to be physical in the manner by which this sphere, this triangle, this hexagon, and this square do. The means by which they meet the criteria to be physical. The non-physical thing we're thinking of, it does not do that. So there's no way that it is a shape. If that's the case, it would not have form. It wouldn't occupy space. It just would not have anything that we can examine of these shapes. It wouldn't have anything of that. It wouldn't be anything like that. It would just be something we can think of that is not those things. It's almost like it's just a metaphor, and that's all. That is why some people think that if God did exist, it would just be purely metaphorical, merely conceptual. It would not actually exist. But some people think that there's more to it than that. But anyway, my point is, this non-physical thing we can think of and talk of here, it clearly we cannot see it in these shapes. If we had these shapes, in, I don't know, you had them in a basket, and they were just like toy shapes, well, it wouldn't be any different than these ones we're looking at. It's just the same thing. It's just one is a picture and the other's toys. Well, if that's really the case, then they would not really be, if you dissected them, if you touched them, you do anything with them, whatever you do with those toy shapes like these, they would not, no matter what you would do, you would just be moving them around by forces external to you and external to them. None of that would actually show that they aren't meeting. In doing any of that, you wouldn't, nothing would be implying that what you're doing to them is somehow going to cause them to not meet the criteria of the term physical, as we went over earlier. They would still meet the criteria of the term physical at every second that you'd be doing those things to the inanimate objects. And as long as they're doing that, as long as they're meeting that criteria, then it's safe to say that they're really not they're not what we call non-physical. The non-physical is something that fails to meet the criteria. It's never shown to be something that meets the criteria. I say shown because that's what the actual tests of science show. The tests of science also show that the physical has never been shown to not meet its own criteria. So it's fair to assume that anything else said by people claiming to be scientists is just pseudoscience and is made up nonsense. That's a safer assumption given what we went over so far when compared side by side. If that's really the case, then it's fair to assume that these shapes are not well, I mean, if you did say that the non-physical is a shape, then you'd have to say that it would be a shape like one of these. You'd have to say that it'd just be a variation of one of these shapes. It would just look like any one of these, but bigger, or with the lines of them going in different, ever so slightly different directions. And the only thing that would really change is the directions in which the lines would go and the size. And none of that actually is any of them being not meeting the criteria of being physical. In fact, every time that we examine shapes or inanimate objects getting bigger, the same thing happens anyway. The lines get bigger, the lines start moving in different directions. And, like, for example, when you have a small seed and you plant it, and then it becomes a tree over the course of time, of course, when it's a smaller, really, really small in its early stages, you can see the lines of its shape, and they're only going in a few directions. But as time progresses, of course, you see that the lines have naturally managed to reach different directions, or many more directions than it began, and its size increased as well because of that. So what we have here is a correlation between change of the directions of the lines, and the size increases by that, going by that. If that's really the case, then there's no reason to assume that that's something that is out of the ordinary here. That just sounds like physical things getting bigger, or shapes like these getting bigger, because that's just how things work. The objects get larger by natural processes that are commonly referred to. So, the way I see it, it's just it's safe to assume that, of course, that pretty much means that, for example, this sphere, if it started to grow bigger by natural processes, then it would just, I mean, let's say like the top here, well, from the start to the front, from the left to the right, from where the line starts, it's kind of like goes up like a roller coaster and down. Well, if it got bigger, that line would start, those segments would start to shoot in different directions and grow into different directions. When objects get bigger, that's what they tend to do. The lines start to go in differing directions than they started off. So that's pretty much all that would happen if that's pretty much all that happens in everyday life when objects get bigger. It's just, that's all it is. The lines are starting to get bigger. If you pay close attention to detail, or the micro details of that, you'll see that's what's happening. Like I was just showing you, it's just, you can imagine a tree being similar to like this, like I was talking about. So it's just, the object just gets bigger, the lines change direction, and that's just a completely normal physical process of science. It's consistent with every finding in science, which you, of course, can refer to if you want, or anybody can, of course, refer to if they want. It's a natural process. It happens by natural processes. It's not just correlated to them, it's caused by them, by certain definitions of the word cause. It's caused by them, and it's pretty much just, that's all there is to it. Basically, all you'd be doing is describing normal physical natural processes when you're pointing out the fact that basic shapes are getting larger and they're becoming different, shaped slightly different. And that's pretty much all that we can really show here for non-physical, because if the non-physical really does exist, then it'd have to be like one of these shapes, and it would just have to, the only thing that could make it any different from these is it'd have to be either bigger or smaller. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure when shapes like these get bigger or smaller, that doesn't mean that they can create things like of their own kind. Like, it doesn't mean they can create shapes. I'm honestly starting to think that if I didn't know any better, I'd say that people not understanding that sounds like a pre-K, or not understanding what natural processes in everyday life actually is. Because, to be honest, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure somebody would have to be pretty mentally ill to think that things can create themselves, or that shapes can create themselves. Most people agree to that, but then when questioned of it, they'd say that something non-physical is like one of these shapes, just bigger or smaller, and is creating these same duplicates of itself like these. When we examine the micro details of it, that's actually all that could be happening. Like I was showing you when we zoom in, it was just, you have to pay attention, you have to really look in close. And as far as I'm concerned, if that's really the case, then there's no reason to believe major religions when they say that if God is non-physical, he's a humanoid apparition that exists inside of the world, or any other non-physical apparition for that matter, existing in the universe according to the religions. It just doesn't sound plausible. It doesn't sound likely. It's not consistent with what the things I just talked about, or that I was showing when zooming in. It completely disregards all those things that are consistent with other things. It's fair to say that means that we can categorize religions as pseudoscience, run by mentally ill lunatics and worshipped by the same kinds of people. But the truth is, I really can't go any further with this, so I'm just going to say that I'm going to have to end the video here. But I really think that this is a good visual, at the very least, compared to the last video I made on the same thing on this channel. That's pretty much all I have to say here for this video. I hope you enjoyed, but I'll be ending it here very briefly. As I said, I have another video to make. Thanks for watching. Bye.